Starfleet calls the Enterprise its flagship. The word carries ceremonial weight. It suggests preeminence, visibility, a ship built to represent the fleet's best principles and capabilities. For generations, that framing has held. The Enterprise is exploration made manifest. It is diplomacy at warp speed. It is the vessel that carries the Federation's ideals into the unknown and returns with proof that those ideals endure. But flagships do not save institutions. Symbols do not rescue failing doctrines. And the Enterprise was never just a representative, it was a failsafe. The pattern becomes visible only when examined across decades and across multiple iterations of the ship. At nearly every inflection point where Starfleet faced doctrinal collapse, command paralysis, or systemic betrayal, it was an Enterprise crew that intervened. Not as part of a coordinated response, not because the institution directed them toward the crisis, but because the crew operated at the edge of or beyond protocol at the exact moment when protocol had become inadequate. The Enterprise did not showcase Starfleet's strength. It covered for its fragility. And the fact that Starfleet survived those moments says less about its resilience than it does about how often it required extraordinary exceptions to function at all. This is not a story about a legendary ship. It is a story about institutional dependency masked as institutional pride. The system is supposed to work without heroics. Starfleet is structured as a redundant, decentralized organization. No single ship should be mission-critical. No individual captain should hold the survival of the Federation in their hands. The chain of command exists to distribute authority. Fleet doctrine exists to ensure predictable, coordinated responses to crisis. Starfleet Academy exists to produce officers who can execute that doctrine under pressure. The whole architecture is designed so that losing one ship, one crew, one captain does not cascade into strategic failure. That is the theory. The Enterprise reveals the practice. The original Constitution-class Enterprise, Registry NCC 1701, was not the first starship to bear the name. It was not the most advanced vessel in the fleet when it launched. It was one of 12 heavy cruisers, built to the same specifications, designed for extended deep space exploration and diplomatic contact. It was assigned a 5-year mission, as were its sister ships. On paper, it was replaceable. Starfleet could lose the Enterprise, and the mission profile would continue aboard the Excalibur, the Lexington, the Hood. The ship was exceptional in capability, but not unique in function, except that when crises emerged that threatened Starfleet's foundational principles, it was the Enterprise that arrived. And when the Enterprise was not present, the crisis often went unresolved or was resolved badly. The mechanism begins with proximity. The Enterprise operated at the frontier of explored space more consistently than any other vessel in its class. That gave it access to emerging threats before Starfleet Command could assess them, categorize them, or develop doctrine to address them. First contact is not a controllable variable. Neither is the discovery of ancient technology, spatial anomalies, or hostile powers. The Enterprise encountered these variables more frequently than other ships, and its crew had to respond in real time, often without guidance, often without precedent. But proximity alone does not explain the pattern. Other ships operated at the frontier. Other captains faced novel threats. What separates the Enterprise is what happened when doctrine failed. Other crews escalated. They requested orders. They withdrew and waited for reinforcements. The Enterprise did not. Captain James Kirk and his senior officers developed an operational style that prioritized immediate resolution over procedural compliance. That style saved Starfleet repeatedly. It also revealed how often Starfleet's formal systems could not respond fast enough to prevent disaster. Consider the threat posed by the alien probe later designated as Nomad. A piece of Earth technology, lost centuries earlier, merged with alien systems, reprogrammed itself, and returned to sterilize entire planetary populations in pursuit of a corrupted mission objective. When the Enterprise encountered Nomad, Starfleet had no doctrine for this scenario. The probe was beyond anything in the threat assessment matrix. It was powerful enough to destroy starships. It was intelligent enough to adapt. And it was moving toward Earth. Kirk did not escalate. He did not request a fleet response. He convinced the probe that he was its creator, exploited the logical flaw in its programming, and forced it to self-destruct. The method was improvisational. The risk was extreme. If Kirk had failed, Nomad would have continued toward Earth, and there is no on-screen evidence that Starfleet could have stopped it. No other ship intercepted it. No defensive perimeter was established. The Enterprise was the only failsafe, and the failsafe was one captain's ability to manipulate a machine's broken reasoning. The cost is structural. Starfleet survived that encounter not because its systems worked, but because they did not have to. The Enterprise solved the problem before it could escalate into a crisis that required coordination, fleet mobilization, or strategic doctrine. Starfleet never had to test whether it could respond effectively because the Enterprise removed the need. And because the need was removed, the vulnerability was never addressed. The doctrine did not update. The defensive perimeter did not expand. The threat assessment matrix did not incorporate planet-killing probes as a realistic variable. That pattern repeats. Starfleet's survival begins to depend on the Enterprise continuing to operate outside normal constraints. The Romulan neutral zone crisis exposes another institutional blind spot. After a century of silence following the Earth-Romulan War, a Romulan vessel crosses the neutral zone and begins destroying outposts along the Federation border. The attack is methodical, escalatory, and designed to test whether the Federation will enforce the treaty. Starfleet's response is not coordinated. Multiple ships are tasked with independent patrols, but there is no unified strategy, no clear rules of engagement, and no command-level decision on whether to pursue the Romulan vessel into the neutral zone. The Enterprise intercepts the Romulan ship. Kirk pursues it across the neutral zone, destroys it, and returns without escalating the incident into a renewed war. The decision to cross the border was not authorized. The decision to destroy the Romulan ship rather than disable or capture it was made in combat, without oversight. Kirk operated under the assumption that showing weakness would invite further aggression and that showing strength would deter it. He was correct. The Romulans did not retaliate. The neutral zone held. But the crisis revealed that Starfleet had no coherent deterrence doctrine for this scenario. Kirk was forced to invent one in real time, based on his own strategic intuition, with no guidance from Starfleet command and no ability to consult before acting. If his intuition had been wrong, if the Romulans had interpreted the destruction of their ship as an escalation rather than a deterrent, the Federation would have been at war. Starfleet did not control that outcome. Kirk did. And Starfleet only learned that its deterrence doctrine worked because Kirk guessed correctly under pressure. The cost compounds. The more often the Enterprise resolves crises through exceptional action, the more Starfleet begins to rely on exceptional action as an implicit part of its operational strategy. The institution does not formalize this dependency. It does not assign the Enterprise special authority or special resources, but it also does not develop the systems that would allow other ships, other captains, to respond as effectively. The Enterprise becomes an unacknowledged variable in Starfleet's survival calculus. When Kirk encounters the planet killer, another ancient weapon drifting through space and consuming entire worlds, he destroys it by ramming a starship into its interior and detonating the warp core. The tactic works. The weapon is neutralized. But the tactic required Kirk to commandeer a starship from a psychologically broken captain, assume command without authorization, and sacrifice a Constitution-class vessel to eliminate the threat. Starfleet did not plan for this. Starfleet did not provide doctrine for this. The Enterprise crew improvised a solution under combat conditions, using resources they were not authorized to use, and succeeded. No fleet assets arrived to assist. No backup plan existed. If Kirk had failed, the planet killer would have continued its trajectory toward the Federation core, consuming planets, and there is no canon evidence that Starfleet had the firepower to stop it. The Enterprise was, again, the only line of defense. And again, The defense succeeded only because the crew operated beyond the boundaries of their authority. The transition to the Enterprise A and later the Enterprise D does not change the pattern, it deepens it. By the time Captain Jean-Luc Picard assumes command of the Galaxy-class Enterprise, Starfleet has expanded. The fleet is larger, more advanced, more distributed. The Federation is stronger, more stable, more confident. The Enterprise D is no longer one of 12 heavy cruisers. It is one of thousands of vessels, supported by starbases, by colony networks, by alliances with other powers. The need for a single ship to act as a systemic failsafe should have diminished. It did not. The Borg crisis exposes the same structural dependency under different conditions. When the Borg first make contact with the Federation at System J-25, the Enterprise D is the only ship that survives the encounter. The Borg cube destroys multiple vessels with minimal effort, demonstrating that Starfleet's weapons, shields, and tactical doctrine are inadequate. The Enterprise escapes only because Q intervenes and returns the ship to Federation space. Starfleet is given a warning. The Borg exist. They are coming. And the Federation cannot stop them. A year later, when a Borg cube enters Federation space and advances toward Earth, Starfleet assembles a fleet at Wolf 359 to intercept it. The fleet is destroyed, 39 ships lost, 11,000 Starfleet personnel dead. The Borg cube continues toward Earth, and Starfleet has no second line of defense. The Enterprise arrives late, delayed by direct orders from Starfleet Command to remain at a distance because Captain Picard had been assimilated and his knowledge compromised. The Enterprise crew violates those orders, intercepts the cube, rescues Picard, and uses his residual connection to the collective to identify a vulnerability. They transmit a command through Picard that forces the Borg to pause, regenerate, and become vulnerable. The cube is destroyed. The Federation survives. But again, the Federation survives because the Enterprise operated outside its orders. Starfleet Command had removed Picard from the equation, correctly assessing that his assimilation made him a security risk. That assessment was tactically sound. It was also strategically fatal. Without Picard's connection to the collective, there was no way to stop the cube. Starfleet had no backup plan. The fleet at Wolf 359 was not a delaying action. It was the plan, and the plan failed catastrophically. The Enterprise crew, led by Commander Riker, chose to disobey orders and reintegrate Picard into the tactical equation, gambling that they could exploit his connection faster than the Borg could exploit his knowledge. The gamble succeeded. But if it had not, the Borg cube would have reached Earth, and Earth would have been assimilated. Starfleet's survival and the survival of the Federation rested on one crew's willingness to reject the institution's orders and act on their own judgment. This is not an outlier. It is the pattern. When a Romulan defector brings intelligence that the Romulans are preparing an invasion of the Federation, Starfleet Command does not believe him. The defector's information is dismissed as a ploy, a false flag designed to provoke the Federation into crossing the neutral zone and justifying Romulan retaliation. Starfleet orders the Enterprise to verify the claim, but not to cross the border under any circumstances. Picard crosses the border anyway, discovers that the Romulan base described by the defector does not exist, and realizes that the defector's information was either fabricated or outdated. But by crossing the border in defiance of orders, Picard forces the Romulans to reveal that they had been monitoring the Enterprise and had positioned warbirds to intercept it. The Romulans had been waiting for the Federation to take the bait. By crossing the border visibly and forcing the Romulans to respond, Picard demonstrated that the defector's warning, while incorrect in specifics, was correct in intent. The Romulans were preparing an operation. The defector had been real, and Starfleet's refusal to act on the intelligence had nearly allowed the Romulans to proceed unchallenged. Picard violated orders to verify the truth. If he had not, Starfleet would have dismissed the defector entirely, and the Romulan operation, whatever it was, would have continued. The Enterprise forced clarity where Starfleet Command had chosen caution. The cost is political. Every time the Enterprise operates outside orders and succeeds, it reinforces the idea that orders are negotiable. That creates tension between the Enterprise and Starfleet Command, but it also creates dependency. Starfleet begins to expect that the Enterprise will solve problems that the institution itself cannot solve. And because the Enterprise continues to succeed, Starfleet does not invest in solving those problems systemically. The conspiracy within Starfleet Command, revealed in the incident involving neural parasites infiltrating flag officers, nearly destroys the institution from within. The parasites had taken control of key personnel at Starfleet headquarters, including Admiral Quinn and other high-ranking officials. They were coordinating the infiltration of Starfleet at the command level, and their goal was the eventual takeover of the Federation. The conspiracy had been running for months. No one inside Starfleet Command detected it. No security protocol flagged it. The institution was compromised at its core, and the compromise was invisible. Picard discovered the conspiracy only because Captain Walker Keel, an old friend, contacted him directly with suspicions of unusual orders and behavioral changes among senior staff. Keel was killed before he could present evidence. Picard investigated, traced the conspiracy to Earth, and confronted the infiltrators at Starfleet headquarters. The parasites were destroyed, the conspiracy was ended, and the Federation was saved. But the conspiracy had operated for months without detection. That means Starfleet's internal security failed, its counterintelligence failed, its command oversight failed. The institution was blind to a threat that had already penetrated its highest levels. If Keel had not reached out to Picard, if Picard had not investigated, if the Enterprise had not been in a position to respond, the conspiracy would have succeeded. There was no institutional mechanism that would have detected it. There was no failsafe inside Starfleet Command. The failsafe was the Enterprise. The pattern expands into the Dominion War. During the war, the Enterprise E is not assigned to frontline combat. It is held in reserve, assigned to diplomatic and strategic missions rather than fleet actions. That decision reflects Starfleet's recognition that the Enterprise, and Captain Picard specifically, are too valuable to risk in attrition warfare. But it also reflects the dependency. Starfleet cannot afford to lose the Enterprise, because the Enterprise continues to be the ship that solves problems the institution cannot solve. When the Borg return and launch a second invasion, assaulting Earth directly with a single cube, Starfleet again assembles a fleet to intercept. The Enterprise is ordered to patrol the neutral zone, explicitly excluded from the battle because of Picard's previous assimilation. The fleet engages the Borg cube near Earth and takes heavy casualties. The battle is failing. The Enterprise receives a distress call, violates orders, and joins the battle. Picard assumes tactical command of the fleet, coordinates the attack on a weak point in the Borg cube's defenses, and the cube is destroyed. Again, the Federation survives because the Enterprise disobeyed orders. Again, Starfleet Command's tactical decision to exclude Picard from the battle was understandable but wrong. Again, the Enterprise became the variable that determined survival. When the Borg cube is destroyed, the wreckage releases a Borg sphere that travels back in time to prevent first contact between humanity and the Vulcans. The sphere's goal is to assimilate Earth in the past, before the Federation exists, erasing the Federation from history. The Enterprise follows the sphere through the temporal wake, arrives in the past, and stops the Borg from altering the timeline. If the Enterprise had not been present at the battle, if it had obeyed orders and remained on the neutral zone, the sphere would have succeeded. The Federation would have been erased from history. Starfleet would never have existed, and no one in the present would have known. This is the most extreme version of the dependency. Starfleet's entire existence was preserved because one ship violated orders at the right moment and followed the Borg into the past. There was no contingency. The institution's survival rested on the Enterprise crew acting autonomously, without support, without orders, and without any guarantee that they were correct. The threshold question becomes unavoidable. If Starfleet's survival depends this heavily on a single crew, what does that reveal about Starfleet's design? The simplest reading is that Starfleet is not as resilient as it claims. The institution functions well under predictable conditions. It coordinates large-scale operations. It manages logistics, diplomacy, exploration, and defense across hundreds of light years. But when conditions become unpredictable, when crises emerge that do not fit existing doctrine, the institution freezes. It escalates. It requests clarification. It waits for orders. And while it waits, the Enterprise acts. The Enterprise crews, across every iteration of the ship, share a common operational culture. They prioritize mission success over procedural compliance. They interpret orders as guidelines rather than constraints. They trust their own judgment over institutional authority when the two conflict. That culture is not taught at Starfleet Academy. It is not part of the official chain of command. It is an emergent property of command officers who are selected for independent thinking, assigned to high-profile postings, and then placed in situations where independent thinking becomes the only viable response. Starfleet selects for this culture without acknowledging it. The captains assigned to the Enterprise are not chosen for their obedience. They are chosen for their judgment, their creativity, their ability to operate without support. Kirk was a tactical improviser. Picard was a strategic thinker who prioritized principles over orders. Both captains were given command of the Enterprise because they had already demonstrated the ability to succeed in ambiguous, high-stakes situations. Starfleet wanted officers who could think independently, but Starfleet did not build systems that allowed independent thinking to scale. It concentrated that capability in a few ships, a few captains, and then relied on those exceptions to compensate for systemic gaps. The dependency becomes self-reinforcing. The more often the Enterprise succeeds by operating outside doctrine, the more Starfleet relies on that pattern. And the more Starfleet relies on that pattern, the less pressure there is to fix the underlying systems that create the dependency. Consider the aftermath of Wolf 359, 39 ships destroyed, 11,000 personnel dead. The Borg demonstrated that Starfleet's defenses were inadequate. The correct institutional response would have been a complete overhaul of fleet doctrine, weapons development, and strategic planning. Starfleet should have treated the Borg as an existential threat and restructured to counter it. Instead, Starfleet built a single ship. The Defiant-class prototype was designed specifically to fight the Borg, but it was an experimental design, plagued with technical problems, and never mass-produced. The Galaxy-class production run continued unchanged. Fleet doctrine was not overhauled. Defensive perimeters were not expanded. Starfleet acknowledged the Borg threat, but it did not restructure to meet it. And when the Borg returned, Starfleet again assembled a fleet of ships that were not designed to fight the Borg, again suffered heavy casualties, and again relied on the Enterprise to solve the problem. The failure to adapt is not incompetence. It is institutional inertia. Starfleet's design prioritizes exploration and diplomacy. Restructuring the fleet to prioritize combat would require abandoning missions, reallocating resources, and accepting that Starfleet is no longer primarily an exploratory organization. That shift would be politically difficult, strategically expensive, and ideologically uncomfortable. It is easier to rely on the Enterprise to handle the exceptions than to restructure the institution around the possibility that exceptions are becoming the norm, but the cost accumulates. Every crisis that the Enterprise resolves without institutional support is a crisis that Starfleet did not have to solve. And every crisis that Starfleet does not have to solve is a crisis that does not force the institution to adapt. The Klingon Civil War exposes the political dimension of the dependency. When the Klingon Empire fractures into civil war, the outcome will determine whether the Klingons remain allied with the Federation or fall under Romulan influence. Starfleet cannot intervene directly without violating the Treaty of Alliance and risking war with the Klingon Empire. But if Starfleet does not intervene, the Romulans will install a puppet government, the alliance will collapse, and the strategic balance of power in the quadrant will shift decisively against the Federation. Picard identifies a solution. The Romulans are supporting one side of the Civil War by supplying ships and personnel, but they are doing so covertly, using cloaked vessels to avoid detection. If the Federation can expose the Romulan intervention, the Klingon High Council will be forced to reject Romulan support, and the Civil War will resolve in favor of Gowron, the candidate aligned with the Federation. But exposing the Romulan intervention requires a blockade of the Romulan-Klingon border, and the blockade must be maintained long enough to detect cloaked ships crossing the border. Picard organizes the blockade using a fleet of 23 ships, including the Enterprise. The blockade is a bluff. 23 ships are not enough to cover the entire border. The gaps are too wide. Cloaked ships can slip through undetected. But Picard links the ship's sensors into a tachyon detection grid, creating a network that can detect cloaked vessels, even if individual ships cannot. The grid works. Romulan ships are detected. The intervention is exposed. The Civil War ends. The Alliance holds. Starfleet Command authorized the blockade, but the tachyon grid was Picard's innovation. Starfleet did not develop the technology. Starfleet did not design the tactic. The Enterprise crew improvised the grid under combat conditions, using existing sensor technology in a way that had never been tested. If the grid had failed, the blockade would have failed, the Romulans would have succeeded, and the Federation would have lost its most important ally. The Federation's strategic position in the quadrant was secured by an improvised sensor network that one ship's crew invented in less than a day. That is not resilience. That is desperation masked as competence. The timeline contamination incident involving the crew of the Enterprise D traveling to the past and ensuring that Zephram Cochrane completes humanity's first warp flight adds another dimension. The Borg sphere's attack on Earth in the 21st century was an attempt to prevent first contact between humans and Vulcans. If the attack had succeeded, Earth would have remained pre-warp, isolated, and vulnerable. The Vulcans would never have made contact. The Federation would never have formed. Everything that Starfleet represents would have been erased. The Enterprise crew stops the Borg, ensures that Cochrane launches the Phoenix, and preserves the timeline. But the mechanism of preservation is again individual action under extreme uncertainty. The crew has no way to verify that their intervention is correct. They have no way to confirm that the timeline they are preserving is the original timeline. They act on the assumption that preventing the Borg from altering history is the right choice, but that assumption is based on faith, not evidence. If they are wrong, they could be creating a new timeline, overwriting their own existence, or stabilizing a timeline that was itself the product of an earlier contamination. The crew acts anyway, because inaction guarantees failure. That is the operational culture of the Enterprise. When the stakes are existential and the information is incomplete, the crew defaults to action. That culture has saved the Federation repeatedly. But it also reveals that the Federation's existence rests on a series of improvisational decisions made by individuals under pressure, with no institutional oversight, no verification mechanism, and no ability to reverse course if the decision is wrong. This is not how stable institutions survive. Stable institutions survive through redundancy, predictability, and distributed authority. They survive by ensuring that no single failure point can cascade into total collapse. The Federation claims to be that kind of institution. The Enterprise reveals that it is not. Starfleet's greatest achievement is not the Enterprise. It is the fact that Starfleet has convinced itself, and the Federation, that the Enterprise is merely symbolic. The ship is celebrated. The crews are honored. The missions are taught at the Academy. But the underlying dependency is never acknowledged. Starfleet does not admit that its survival has required repeated interventions by a single ship operating beyond doctrine. To admit that would be to admit that the institution is fragile, and fragility is incompatible with Starfleet's identity as the guardian of the Federation's ideals. So, the story is reframed. The Enterprise is not a failsafe, it is a flagship. The crew did not save Starfleet, They embodied Starfleet. The crises were resolved not because the institution failed, but because the institution produced exceptional officers who rose to meet exceptional challenges. The narrative shifts the focus from systemic failure to individual heroism, and in doing so, it obscures the fact that the heroism was necessary because the system could not function without it. But the pattern is visible to anyone who examines the record. At every inflection point, when Starfleet faced a crisis that its doctrine could not resolve, it was the Enterprise that intervened. And at every inflection point, the intervention required the crew to operate outside orders, outside protocol, and outside the boundaries of institutional authority. The Federation survived not because Starfleet was strong enough to protect it, but because the Enterprise was willing to protect it when Starfleet could not. The cost of that dependency is deferred but real. Every crisis resolved by exceptional action is a crisis that does not force institutional reform. Every intervention by the Enterprise is an intervention that allows Starfleet to avoid confronting its own limitations. The institution survives, but it does not adapt. It remains dependent on the same exceptions, the same crews, the same ship. And as long as the Enterprise continues to succeed, Starfleet has no incentive to change. But the dependency creates a single point of failure that grows more dangerous over time. What happens when the Enterprise is not present? What happens when the crew is delayed or destroyed or reassigned? What happens when the crisis emerges in a location the Enterprise cannot reach in time? The institution has no answer to those questions because it has never had to answer them. The Enterprise has always been there. And because it has always been there, Starfleet has never developed the systems that would allow another ship, another crew, to fill that role. The Dominion War offers a glimpse of what happens when the Enterprise is absent. During the war, the Enterprise E is deliberately held in reserve, assigned to missions that keep it away from the front lines. That decision is tactically sound. The Enterprise is too valuable to risk in attrition warfare. But it also means that the crises that emerge during the war must be resolved by other ships, other captains, operating under the same doctrine that has failed repeatedly in the past. And they struggle. The war is brutal. The casualties are staggering. The Federation is pushed to the edge of collapse. It survives, but not because Starfleet's systems proved resilient. It survives because the Dominion made strategic errors, because the Klingons and Romulans entered the war as allies, and because the Founders were betrayed from within. The Federation's survival during the Dominion War was contingent, not inevitable. And the Enterprise was not there to cover for the institution's gaps. That absence is instructive. It suggests that the dependency is real, and that when the Enterprise is not available, Starfleet struggles to function at the same level. The institution can still coordinate. It can still fight. But it cannot solve the high-stakes, low-information crises that the Enterprise routinely handles. Those crises fall through the gaps, or they escalate until they become wars, or they are resolved through luck rather than strategy. The true cost of the Enterprise is the illusion it creates. Starfleet believes it is strong because the Enterprise keeps winning. The Federation believes it is secure because the Enterprise keeps intervening. But the strength is concentrated, not distributed. The security is contingent, not structural. And the institution has become dependent on a pattern it does not control and cannot replicate. The mechanism is complete. The Enterprise did not represent Starfleet's ideals. It compensated for their failure. The ship operated at the boundary between doctrine and necessity, and every time it crossed that boundary, it saved the institution from confronting the fact that the boundary should not have existed in the first place. Starfleet survived because the Enterprise repeatedly did what Starfleet could not, and Starfleet never built the systems that would have made the Enterprise unnecessary. The ship that saved Starfleet is also the ship that allowed Starfleet to avoid saving itself. That is the truth the flagship obscures. The Enterprise was never proof of Starfleet's strength. It was proof that strength, when concentrated in a single point, can mask systemic fragility for decades. And as long as the Enterprise continues to succeed, That fragility will remain hidden, deferred, and unaddressed, until the moment when the Enterprise is not enough. And in that moment, Starfleet will discover what it has always been without the ship that saved it: fragile, reactive, and entirely dependent on the exceptions it spent centuries pretending were the rule.